Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm Steve Richardson, a bankruptcy attorney trying to keep people on their path to financial stability and independence through education. Where you live can have a significant effect on your financial freedom, whether it's during your working life or in retirement. It can influence cost of living, opportunities in your career, or resale values when you're ready to downsize. That's why in this episode of the podcast, I talked to Ryan Frederick about how he sees where you live and how location means so much more to your financial well-being. My guest today is Ryan Frederick, the founder and CEO of Here, and a nationally recognized thought leader, author, speaker, real estate developer, and strategy consultant specializing in place and healthy longevity with nearly 20 years in the field. His recent best-selling book, Right Place, Right Time, The Ultimate Guide to Choosing a Home for the Second Half of Your Life, provides a blueprint for how to integrate where to live into successful life planning for empty nesters and retirees. He's now extending this approach for people across the age spectrum. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve. Good to be here.
Yeah. So and looking at your website, and what you do, it seems like you're taking somewhat of a different approach to retirement and even before retirement, personal finance and financial freedom than what a lot of people think about when they think about those things. Your company is called Here, and you talk about the importance of place. Now, how does where you live affect your personal finances? How should people think about that?
Yeah, well, Steve, it affects you in a pretty profound way. And what I would say to start off is we're in this fascinating time of the history of the world, really,
Mhm.
with the degree of change, and most recently the Chat GPT. These things that are just either changing our lives or promise to change them. And one of these trends is around longevity. So if you look at, I would argue one of the biggest success stories of the 20th century was life expectancy more or less doubled from
Mhm.
a little bit under 40 to approaching 80.
Mhm.
And today, for college educated people, it continues to rise.
Mhm.
Experts say that kids born today in the US, 50% of them are expected to live to 100.
Hmm. Wow.
So when we think about, it's great, I think, generally living longer, so long as we are healthy over that period of time. And to your point, we're also financially secure over that period of time. And so the reason why place matters is when we look at the research around longevity, it's much really linked to our lifestyle and environment,
Mhm.
much more than our genes. Our genes only account for about 7% of our longevity. And so where we decide to live, how we decide to engage where we live, I believe, and the research bears it out, has a pretty profound impact on where we find purpose, how we're socially connected, how physically active we are and physically well, and also our financial health. And so from a financial perspective, just take that leg of the stool, as it were, uh, when we think about living a longer life, and just the variability, the different factors that we control and don't control over that period of time. For many of us, housing is among our highest, if not the highest cost we have. So we have to duly think about it in terms of the cost implications, but also the investment implications
Mhm.
and the way in which it helps us. So it's not, to your point, it's not just something that you think about, oh goodness, I'm going to retire. How do I think about it? No, I think this is really a core competency that many
Mhm.
of us need to lean into. Are we living in the right place for our stage in life? And how does it factor into our financial planning for a longer life? There
Mhm.
may be periods of time, for example, where we got three kids, we got three teenagers. It's a handful, and they need space. We need space from time to time, my wife and I. And so this is a time when having a larger house probably is the right call, probably the
Mhm.
right call for us. But as we look ahead for other chapters in life, we may want to consider alternative housing environments and places where we don't have as much space and therefore as much kind of as much of a monthly nut to
Mhm.
cover in our expenses. So this there's part of the idea is, hey, this matters a lot financially and beyond finances certainly, but how do you think about making sure that you're in the right place at the right time for your chapter in life?
Well, it sounds to me like there are more than one aspect or axis to this. I mean, where you live can affect your finances to the extent of, like you said, cost of living. How, when you buy this home, what's the market? How much does it cost to get a 3 bedroom, 2.5 bath home? And therefore, what is your mortgage payment, which
Yes.
affects your finances in the long term? But also, how it affects you, like you say, you have 3 teenagers. You know, is your home big enough? Do you have enough home, or do you have too much home? And that effect can go to your well-being and your happiness, beyond the financial aspect of it, right?
Yeah, it does. And I would say for you and your listeners or
Mhm.
viewers, I guess with YouTube as well, Steve,
Uh,
this is not directly related to financial, but allow me just to take a quick detour. And
mhm,
that is, I'm just really concerned with our society around the state of our friendships.
mhm,
You're seeing more and more sociologists, some psychologists talk about this idea of we're in a friendship recession,
mhm,
where as compared to 30 years ago, there was a study, an analysis of the American Time Use Survey,
mhm,
and 30 years ago, there were 5 times as many people who had, or there were a fifth of the people then as compared to today who said, I have no friends outside my close family.
hmm,
On the other side, there were roughly, this is for men, but very similar for women. There were about 5 times more people 30 years ago that said they had at least 10 close friends outside of family.
mhm,
We're in a place right now, another data set, but from the same source showed that since 2013, on average, across all age groups, incomes, ethnicities, people on average are spending 10 more hours per week alone.
mhm,
Uh, Maybe it's streaming Ted Lasso. I don't know what the different pieces are, but the reality is um, there's, I think, a lot of advantages of technology, but there's things that are separating us.
mhm,
And so if we don't feel socially connected with people that we care about, nurturing some of those friendships, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, that impacts your health, but also your motivation to make
mhm,
the right set of decisions. And so I've seen some situations where people are in a home environment where it may or may not make sense for their financial situation, but objectively, it's the wrong place for them for them to thrive.
mhm,
And in some cases, it may mean that you need to make a change or make an investment, make a
mhm,
financial investment in a different place for which you're around people that you can relate better to or more often, just an example, or even from a physical health perspective, it's easier to just walk in the neighborhood. You pick it. But
mhm,
I just encourage people when you're planning for a successful long life,
mhm.
financial is a really important piece, but it's not the only piece. And it has a relationship to these other. I find more and more as I talk to people, I do my talks and do workshops that people are struggling right now in having the level of variety and depth of friendships than they once did.
Well, I think that adds another axis, another aspect or dimension to all of this. I mean, we've talked about cost of living, your mortgage payment, how it affects you financially, and you may be looking to move, maybe to a different state with a lower cost of living, or just in a larger state. Move, like if you live in Texas, a move across the state can be huge. Uh, but if you're moving away from all of your friends and family, that move can be very isolating. and you may be in an attempt to save money and maybe get into a better financial situation, you make your life or lifestyle or quality of life worse because you've isolated yourself, right?
Yeah, Steve, that's right on. I have right now I'm in the process of doing some beta workshops
Hmm.
based on the content on the website and my book, and it's looking like we'll roll those out as an option for consumers probably in the fall.
Hmm.
And a woman that recently participated in one of these workshops, she fit exactly that profile, Steve. She's in they live in the Salt Lake City area. She and her husband do. They are they're on in a fixed income situation.
Hmm.
They have family in the area, but they're concerned about the cost of living
Hmm.
now of the area, and they're looking to move. But when I talk to her, uh, and I talk about this in the book, and we go through the workshops as well,
Hmm.
there sometimes a move to a lower cost of living can lead not only to a lower quality of life, potentially, not necessarily, but potentially, but it can lead to a higher cost of living or higher total cost if you end up making a mistake.
Hmm.
If you decide we're going to move to this lower cost of area and then you're there and you're like, oh goodness, this
Hmm.
is not what we thought it was.
Hmm.
And then you have to reinitiate another move.
Hmm.
A lot of the transaction costs and then also the emotional energy of
Hmm.
these things can be problematic. So it is, you're exactly right. It is, you can't lose sight of the financial, but it's broader than that. And if you go down the wrong path, you think you're making the right financial decision. Actually, you could be making the wrong one
Hmm.
as it plays out.
Well, an interesting hybrid of that. There's a story I read a while back of a New Jersey state employee. He retired, and what he did was he took some of his retirement money and he bought a home, I believe, in Florida. And he moved down there. He kept his home up here. He moved to Florida and he lived there at least 181 days.
Right.
And he maintained both residences.
Yeah.
And because he was able to establish his primary residence in Florida, from a state income tax standpoint, the savings in tax on his pension income more than paid for the cost of the home in Florida. So you're moving back and forth, and maybe in establishing that residency in another state that might be more retirement friendly. Uh, but you can still come back and have that social connection with your friends because you're not gone, you know, the whole year. You're kind of going back and forth and maybe just getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah. Steve is an excellent point, and this is coming up more and more. So let me take a step back for just a second. So when I talk about place,
Mm-hmm.
I particularly physical place, I see it as a composite of your four walls. So
Mm-hmm.
your house, apartment, your four walls there.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, it's your neighborhood, one block, one level up.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's, are you in a suburban, rural, or urban area?
Mm-hmm.
Then what metropolitan area are you in?
Mm-hmm.
What state? What region? Kind of what country, what region of the world that gets a composite. So as you go
Mm-hmm.
through this, you might say, okay, well, um, I'm having issues now with the appropriateness of my dwelling, my four walls, but I love my neighborhood. So I want to stay in my neighborhood, but I need a different physical place. Maybe you remodel your place, maybe you move to another home, or to your point, you might find that uh, there's such a discrepancy, there's such a weight related to the fiscal policies of your state that
Mm-hmm.
it creates opportunities to think about other state moves. And
Mm-hmm.
I do a blog every other week. You can sign up for it at the here.life website, and one of them, I want to say a couple months ago, was specifically this state analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just income tax, although clearly that matters, like in the example, but you've also got property tax, you got inheritance tax, there's a number of sales tax, a number of layers in there. But I'm finding more and more people from California, New Jersey, New York, that the math that you describe can be pretty interesting math.
Mhm.
where if they can find a way to do just one day, 181 days, like you describe, and then they're able to time it so that they're back to where they previously were living. Maybe their physical dwelling changes, but they're still in that cohort, that same neighborhood or cluster of people, and they time it in such a way that that's when their friends are also there.
Mhm.
Then they're able to maintain these valuable relationships. And when they're in this example in Florida, when you're there, so there's opportunities at that point to create that local community there as well. So I think you're onto something. I think more and more people are going through some of that math.
Yeah. So we've talked about how place and location can affect you, in your working life and things like that, and happiness and your personal finance. And also, just quickly to the point of longevity, if people are living longer and they're saying 50% of the population might live to be 100, that really impacts your retirement investment and savings plan, because if you're going to be living longer in retirement, that money has to last longer.
That's right.
So that's an aspect. So when people retire, they're empty nesters, or they never, and they're looking to downsize. It can matter where, what state you're living in now, and the real estate market, and where you're moving to. In the sense of, if you live now in a good real estate market, you can maximize the net equity in your home upon sale, and then go to a place where you can get the most home for that money. So how does location and everything affect this downsizing in retirement?
Hugely, Steve. I mean, take a step back again. Like my premise is that location, it matters. Place matters where you go to college. It matters where you get your first job. It matters where, when you meet your partner, where do you want to
Mhm.
live with kids? Like every transition in life,
Mhm.
place is like right in front of you to make some intentional decision.
Mhm.
And when empty nesting is one, we're going to be 3 years from now, we'll be at that stage where that introduces, new degrees of freedom. And then of course, retirement is another logical one.
Mhm.
And just a quick thing on retire, that word, it's a controversial word. Of course,
Mhm.
it's a widely adopted word, but retire by the definition is to withdraw, to
Mhm.
remove from. I
Mhm.
remember watching the baseball playoffs a couple of years ago, and a guy hit a ball to right left field. He caught it. The announcer said, "The batter is retired," wiped off the screen. So so when we think about this, I think it's just, even psychologically, it's not retire from, it's retire to. What do I want that next chapter to be? When I kind of find my place, there's place physically, but there's also metaphorically. Am I with my people? Am I doing things I care about?
Mhm.
To your point about place, this is why paying attention to what's happening around expected longevity is so important.
Mhm.
Because if you're optimizing for living towards 80, when you should be optimizing towards living to 90 or 95, there's a lot of variability in that. It's where the Monte Carlo analysis is so important for financial planning, because you're taking all these different scenarios.
Mhm.
And for couples, it's particularly important because it's not just you get the variability of either person living for
Mhm.
a longer stretch of time. So one of the pieces, as you think about it, is whether you decide to move from your physical dwelling or not,
Mhm.
is making sure that your physical dwelling can last as long as you would potentially like it to be. So, for example, uh, in the U.S., only about 4% of all of the housing stock in the U.S. is designed for people with some limited mobility
Mhm.
challenges. So it's stairs, doorways, whatever. So a lot of our housing stock was effectively designed as though we weren't expecting to age.
Mhm.
And so one thing we can do that's helpful from a financial responsibility perspective is we can go into either remodel our homes or move into homes where we can anticipate potential physical changes down the road that doesn't like trigger, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, I now, because there's stairs, I have to move. like there's some, doesn't mean, just it's an element of thinking. We moved from the mid-Atlantic to Austin, Texas about 3.5 years ago. My wife, she makes fun of me a bit because I'm having this thinking of longer term planning and longevity. I look through a lens that most people don't. So we had to make some changes in our landscape. I talked to our landscape architect. There's a way we changed a pathway. So there's a way from our front door or from our driveway to not have any steps. There were steps there before. And it's like, why would I do that? Trust me. And in some cases too, Steve, it's not just thinking about yourself, it's about people that come visit. How can you accommodate people for variety of needs? So I think there is this important analysis that you just described, like how is it retire to in mindset and geography as it pertains. And as the goalpost gets moved further away, how can we be mindful that we have a good handle on our life costs, and we and so that we're in part of that, how can we do it in such a way that it allows us, so we're not forced to move before we might have to, through the design.
Well, so absolutely. And again, adding another dimension to this, I mean, I brought it up initially to say, you're moving to retirement, you're moving from where you're living and getting the most bang for your buck and saying, okay, where can I move to where I will get the most home for my money? But also in looking at where you buy and what you buy, considering aging in place. Is this the home? It might meet your current needs, but can it be modified down the road to accommodate your needs as you get older? Are you buying a home that has 2 or 3 stories, or are you buying a rancher that has one level? How many steps are there? Can this be modified later? So you really, as your, retirement is lasting longer, how's your health now as opposed to later? That's something you really need to think about.
You do, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I have a very short self-assessment tool. It's called the Right Place Assessment on the here.life website. And one of the things it allows you to do is just take stock on your current home. In what way does my current home meet my needs for purpose, for social connection, for physical well-being, for financial security, and then my physical needs? And I find that's a good place to start, Steve, because upwards to 90% of people say they want to age in place. I have a chapter in my book, and I've talked about this in some of my blogs, about how rarely is aging in your current, to the extent someone's in a suburban multi-story home, rarely is aging in your in place in your that current home the right strategy for the long term. It very rarely is. And so I advocate in the book thinking about living in community, or alternatively, just being really intentional about aging in the right place for each stage of life. And so you mentioned earlier, if you were to move to get the right kind of house for you, what we're really solving for is life. What's the right life for you? And that's why we had that dialogue earlier, getting the big house that you downsize to lower cost living, but then feeling socially disconnected may be a lot worse than having a marginally higher cost living in your current neighborhood. They're just trade-offs. And so you could be, in fact, I see this with the assessment tool. I see people that are financially secure, but lacking purpose, feeling disconnected, and so on. So that's why toggling these together is so important.
Well, you actually anticipated my next question. I was going to talk about your right place assessment because I saw that on your website when I was looking at it. And you talked about that assessment in terms of this housing and everything. Could you give us a broader idea and walk us through the kind of overall issues that this talks about? Because I'm sure it's more it deals with more than just that transition in retirement and
Yeah,
down.
absolutely. So yeah, I would say the assessment itself, just like the premise that I'm sharing with you, is age agnostic. It's that where you live matters no matter what stage and transition in life. It's been fascinating, Steve.
Mhm,
Thousands of people have taken this assessment tool from all over the world now. I
mhm,
had a half a dozen people take it yesterday from India, for example. There's a group in England that wants to do a British version of it. So it's I guess add words like bloke and so on to to customize it. So it is, and I think what's happened with being on the other side of the pandemic,
mhm,
I think what's happened with technology, with the hybrid working, some of the social isolation pieces I mentioned earlier, I think place is on the mind of a lot of people, no matter what your age. Um, so what the assessment does is, as we've talked about, um, really helps people think in a real quick way, helps them think, see their where they live as more than just a place to hang their hat
mhm,
or potentially their most valuable investment in their investment portfolio.
mhm,
It is foundational for purpose. It's foundational for social connection, for physical well-being. Of course, in ties into your physical, your financial situation, but also just play. Your place in of itself. Do you does it meet your physical needs today and tomorrow? And does it meet your, I would say, emotional and psychological? Is it home? You can move somewhere else, and then it may check some boxes, but like, gosh, this isn't me. This is
mhm,
not who I am, and so and I've seen that come up a number of times now. So what the tool does is in a series of about 5 questions in each dimension allows you to quickly get a preliminary sense of where do I sit on this today. And you, as I mentioned earlier, you might be in a situation where, okay, I feel like I'm financially secure in my current place, but man, it's not meeting my physical needs. Like,
mhm,
it's too big, I got stairs, I got to figure that out. Or you could be in a situation where it meets your physical needs, but now as you think about living longer, maybe it's too much of a burden
mhm,
with your financial situation. So part of it is, if you're out of whack in any one of those areas,
uh-huh,
the assessment tool then provides some specific advice, some resources for you to lean into in any one of those 5 different areas.
mhm,
Um, it may be, in most cases, Steve, I don't think it necessarily means that people need to move. It just means that there's subtle things, and maybe not so subtle at times, things you can do to make your current place better.
mhm,
But in some situations, I found uh, the best option may be to move,
mhm,
and to think about it strategically. Oh my gosh, if I move, it creates a clean slate in a bunch of these other areas. I know that blue zones is a
mhm,
concept you may be familiar with. Dan Buettner wrote about it about 20 years ago and went to the 5 places in the world where people live the longest and healthiest.
uh-huh,
Costa Rica, Japan, Italy, and it came back, and here are some of the lessons from it. And through some of his research networks, one of the conclusions they came to is, if you're concerned, for example, about eating better or walking more, exercising, rather than working on those habits on your own, the biggest thing you can do is just change your environment.
mhm,
And I think that's, for some people, even financially, that can be the big thing. One other thing that we haven't mentioned, I want to mention, and that is, there can be a stigma related to renting.
mhm,
I know for decades, certainly in the past generations, you might be a renter, and then you graduated to home ownership, and then, well, I'm a homeowner. Why would I ever not be a homeowner? Well, I think you're starting to see, Steve, some people think about this in a more nuanced way, where, uh, especially as you're living longer, uh, the idea of freeing up some of that capital from your house to then reinvest it in more of a portfolio that gives you a different risk pool than having your assets in one place. and recognizing that in some cases, renting is more predictable than what the costs are with home maintenance, given you got to change the roof or appliances, all that kind of stuff. So one of the trends in real estate, you're seeing more purpose-built single family rental homes
Mm-hmm.
that I'm seeing definitely some younger people, but I'm seeing some people in the second half of life as well. So, you know what? I like the idea of being in a smaller single family house dwelling. It has some of those elements we talked about with universal design. It's age friendly,
Mm-hmm.
but I've got a more predictable cost of my life. Now you have to be mindful of inflationary rent going up over time, but it's something that prior generations didn't think about. I think there was a stigma associated with it, but I think you're starting to see more people that are becoming renters by choice,
Mm-hmm.
where it's another option to consider.
One of the other things you mentioned on your website and everything, you say that there are a lot of questions that financial advisors need to be asking their clients about where they want to live. I guess the thing is, if one of our listeners go to their financial advisor or talk to one, and the financial advisor isn't asking those questions, what should they bring up with the financial advisor to make sure that those issues are addressed?
So, Steve, that's a great question. Yeah, I think we're in an interesting time right now in the financial planning, financial advisory business,
Mm-hmm.
because, and I'm seeing more and more financial planning organizations, practices are reaching out to me and to here because of the content around how to think more strategically about place. I think what's happening is you're seeing some percentage. I'm not sure. You might have a more informed view on this, Steve, but
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing some percentage of financial advisory firms that I would say they're a little bit stuck in the past, where they're all we talk about is financial advice, investment advice. Actually, I'll even pin investment advice,
Mm-hmm.
and that's important. That's critical. That's the core competency. But I think more and more individuals are saying, well, that's great, but I'm actually trying to solve for a life. I'm living long. Like, what should my life? Can you help me be thinking about this in other ways, that the other areas that life touches my financial health, but
Mm-hmm.
also life in general. And so I think you're seeing another set of wealth advisory, financial advisory firms that are leaning into this question around how can we help you plan for a healthy, financially secure, purposeful, socially connected, long life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those advisors, they have a question, and that is, how much can they provide some of that content, and to what degree they partner with others. And
Mm-hmm.
so, back to your initial question, if I'm an individual,
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend the individual doesn't take the framework that the financial advisor uses as the framework that's necessarily going to work for them solving for their long life,
Mm-hmm.
because that framework may lean too heavily on financial issues only.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would recommend the individuals, when they have a conversation with their wealth advisor, the financial planners, ask questions like, okay, well, how should my financial plan now be modified to consider that I might live longer than I thought initially? How should I be thinking more intentionally about where I live here? Does it give me enough flexibility for changes that happen in my life? How am I certain that my financial plan is going to help me thrive more broadly than these other? Those are really good questions, and I think that it will allow your financial planner, wealth advisor,
Mm-hmm.
to give you a thoughtful response, or not,
Mm-hmm.
or it may lead them down a path of, let's go figure this out together.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got a gap right now where these questions are becoming more and more important to people, and they need a team often to sort out how to get to a great place. So it's a great question. I think I think 5 to 10 years from now, Steve, I think you're going to see more and more wealth advisors, financial practices have more thoughtful tools and content where
Mhm.
it's not just around optimizing your investment portfolio, because
Mhm.
more and more robo investment capabilities can do some of that,
Mhm.
but really lean into, okay, we're gonna be partners to help optimize your life satisfaction.
Because how you want to live in retirement is can be very important in how you plan for it. So not only in longevity, but to say, look, uh, I may live longer. How can I make the money last? But also when I retire, we want to be able to travel. We want to be able to
Totally.
do X, Y, and Z.
Yep.
How should our financial plan now uh, be crafted to prepare for that, so that when we do retire, when we retire to a place where we can travel or whatever our goals are, we have the money to do that.
So this is 100%. And this is where you then have, most people anyway, have some of these trade-offs. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, if I want to allocate more time to travel, what are the implications for the amount of dollars and risk I want to be exposed to in my place?
Mhm.
And so if you buy a bigger house with all of the things that come with that,
Mhm.
in what way am I unintentionally taking resources away from my travel?
Mhm.
And the other thing too, and this is an important one to raise with your financial planner and think about yourself too. And this is, so much of this discussion is about risk.
Mhm.
And so I'll pick Austin, for example. Austin, a lot of people have been moving here. Real estate has been increasing for a number of years. If you talk to people in Austin a year and a half ago, uh, people might say, "Oh my gosh, my house just keeps going on and up. It'll keep doing that. This is just how this thing works. Why would I ever think about downsize? Because if I anytime I want to sell my house, snap my fingers, my house is going to sell, and to someone moving in from New Jersey or California, whatever." Well, that's not how it's working today. If you
Mhm.
want to sell your house, the market's a lot tighter. The ability to get what you want is different. The ability to sell the house on a timely basis is different. So I think it's important as people think about what their goals are. Um, your how you handle where you live as an owned asset or a rental asset. You just need to factor in the risk associated with it.
Mhm.
One other anecdote on this. Several years ago, my dad's from Pittsburgh. We're Steelers fans, and we went saw where my dad used to live and some of our lineage there. And then in the greater Pittsburgh area, then we drove out 2 hours or so away from the city, and the city's doing well. It was at the time. I think it still is now, but 2 or 3 hours outside, it's not doing so well. You
Mhm.
saw a lot of for sale signs uh, where there were not buyers on the other side.
Mhm.
So I would also encourage people to just think about where they are. If they're an owner, where they are, and if they were moved to buy, what is the likely trajectory of that metropolitan area? Because you might find yourself with a quote unquote asset
Mhm.
that 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now may not be as liquid and at the price. And also, we haven't even touched on this, is the climate change component of this,
Mhm.
because you might find yourself in a spot that's not as desirable because of climate change,
Mhm.
down the road. Not only desirable for you, but not as desirable for a potential buyer if you're a homeowner. So there's a number of variables that for you to consider, but really your financial planner and wealth advisors should be thinking about as well.
Yeah, you mentioned climate change. I mean, they were talking. I was reading an article recently about how, climate change is shifting what they call Tornado Alley. There have been a lot
Yep.
of big storms and tornadoes in the Midwest and everything else, and and it seems to be moving east. So, depending on what your retirement horizon is down the road, how much change we may see in climate can affect where you want to retire to, and you need to take that into account. And
Yeah,
I'm one of
I
a
would,
crystal
yeah.
ball.
No, no, neither do I. But we know it is changing, and I think you've got there's a couple pieces of that. You've got a piece of it, Steve, which is related to desirability.
Mm,
There's a woman that participated in a recent workshop, and she's in Florida, and she's like, I don't think she'd moved from other place. She's like, I don't think I don't have the tolerance for all that's involved with the hurricane risk
mm,
here. But then you also have financial implications related to like insurance. You know,
mm,
you're gonna like hazard insurance in different forms goes up to follow some of what's happening. And
mm.
so either your cost of living goes up because of the insurance, or your risk exposure to it goes up. I know friends of mine in California, earthquake insurance is really expensive to get. So
Yeah.
many people don't have it. But if a big one rolled through, that's a pretty massive event for people. And so again, a lot of it goes back to risk tolerance
Mhm.
and what, where you fall on that. But that's it's a moving target, as you
Yeah.
point out.
Well, my wife and I vacationed in South Carolina many, many years ago, and one of the things we talked about, would we ever want to live down there? I said, well, there are three words that are stopping us. There are these signs all over as you drive down towards Myrtle Beach and hurricane evacuation route.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I started thinking about that. I'm like, I don't know whether I
Yeah.
want to be living under the pall of something like that.
Yeah, well, it's true, but South Carolina is one of the number of southern states that's continues to grow.
Yeah.
And going back to our comment earlier, it fits in that same bucket of how do I and what I'm valuing, how does it compare to maybe a state I'm currently in? And
Mm.
that's the hurricane risk is one factor for some people. I know my wife is absolutely petrified of tornadoes.
Oh
So
yeah.
we would not live in a tornado place just because of for her it's binary. No.
No. Yeah.
But for others, it may be, hey, that's just another factor, and here's how we
Mm,
solve for it in different ways. One other piece, Steve, I was just thinking we haven't touched on, which I think is important for your listeners and viewers, is that uh, this idea that people change and places change. And
mm,
we touched it on a little bit, but to make it more explicit, uh, what we value changes over the course of our lives. Our health changes, our income,
mhm,
changes, and when we change, that can precipitate a reevaluation of place.
mhm,
But also places change. We talked about climate change. We've got tax policies. We hit that earlier. We've got political changes. You might be in a spot where you felt good politically, but now you can't go along with your neighbors, because they have different political views, and so places change, and it's
mhm,
it's kind of calibrating both of those when you're making sure you're in the right place for a given time. Because I know with some of the workshops we've done here in Austin's changed a lot, and so people have reflected on uh, I've changed, but Austin has changed. And so now I need to reevaluate, do I want to sign up for this Austin? Or as I think about as an empty nester or a retiree, do I want to choose a different place?
mhm,
And that's part of it. Just this, I advocate this discipline. It doesn't happen have to happen every day, but with some regularity. Maybe it's every year. You take a step back. Maybe it's around, the changing of the year and say, okay, am I in the right place?
mhm,
And almost recognizing that if you decide to not change or not do something to your existing place, you're choosing that. You're almost choosing, you're reselecting where you are. I think oftentimes what happens to people is just time just goes. It just goes, and then you don't realize how much you've changed or your place has changed, and you may have missed a window for intervention earlier that would have positively impacted your life.
mhm. Well, this is a great discussion and really brings up a dimension to retirement planning and how you live your life now in anticipation of retirement. And I'm sure listeners and viewers will get a lot out of that, a lot of questions they need to ask themselves and their financial professionals. If folks want to reach out to you or take this um, right place assessment on you, how can they reach out to you and get some more information from you?
Yeah. So the best place to go is go to here.life, HERE.life.
Hmm.
And you will, there, you'll have an opportunity to see a bunch of content that's there. you'll have an opportunity also to take that assessment. It's real brief, but then comes back, gives you a graph, and then some specific recommendations. And then I'll also provide my direct email address for those for which this is a hot matter, and it's Ryan, RYAN, at here.life. And I'd be on the lookout for these workshops I mentioned. We're in a beta phase right now of these workshops, but they've gone really well. People have everyone's taken it, has strongly recommended to others in the follow-up survey, and people have given it a 9 out of 10 in terms of the experience. So I think there's a real opportunity for more people to lean into place, Steve,
Mhm.
and to think more deeply about what it is, and also perhaps do it in community. That's what we're finding with these workshops, is that it's one thing to get the content with the book, right
Mhm.
place, right time, and I think that's valuable in and of itself, but it's another thing to follow a process and do it with others.
Mhm.
So to really be confident you're either in the right place or you're on a path to a better one. So I think more and more, I describe it sometimes, Steve, as places hidden in plain sight. It's like right in
Mhm.
front of us, but we don't see it. And I think it's one of these just foundational decisions I think more and more our society is going to wake up to. Because if we get that right, it
Mhm.
makes everything else easier.
Mhm. Well, I appreciate all this great information, and thank you for coming on the show. And I know our listeners will get a lot out of it. And I hope you enjoy your weekend.
Okay, appreciate it. Thanks, Steve.
Mhm.